Canadian physician Gabor Mate and television psychologist Dr. Phil are two seemingly polar opposites on the surface, but they both emphasize the importance of thinking in fundamentals. From Gabor Mate's holistic approach to healthcare to Dr. Phil's focus on individual well-being, both practitioners recognize the need for humans to look beyond the surface of any issue. This is especially true when it comes to critical race theory and why it matters to think in fundamentals. Critical race theory is a way of looking at the world that acknowledges the importance of race in social and political contexts. It is important to think in fundamentals when discussing critical race theory because it allows for an open and unbiased thought process. By thinking in fundamentals, we are able to understand the complexities of the issue and approach it with a clear mind. Gabor Mate is a Canadian physician who advocates for a holistic approach to healthcare that focuses on mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual well-being. His practice considers the underlying causes of illness, such as stress or trauma, rather than just treating symptoms. He emphasizes that healthcare must take into account social determinants like poverty and racism in order for people to achieve optimal physical and mental health outcomes. By focusing on the whole person, Mate is able to help his patients access the resources they need to heal. By including these factors into the equation, healthcare can help to eliminate some of the barriers that prevent people from accessing quality care. For example, poverty can lead to a lack of access to quality nutrition, which can lead to health problems such as obesity or diabetes. Racism can also lead to socioeconomic disparities in access to healthcare, education, and employment. By thinking in fundamentals, we can start to address the root causes of many health problems. Dr. Phil McGraw is an American TV psychologist who focuses on mental health issues with an emphasis on self-help strategies that help individuals gain control over their lives. His advice centers around understanding underlying feelings and motivations behind our behavior so that we can make better choices going forward in our lives. He also stresses the importance of being proactive in order to foster positive changes instead of waiting until a situation is out of control before taking action. This is important in the context of critical race theory, as it allows us to identify potential sources of injustice and address them before they become more entrenched in our society. Dr. Phil's and Dr. Mate's approach to mental health is an important part of understanding the complexities of critical race theory. By thinking in fundamentals, we can gain a better understanding of how systemic racism has impacted our world and how we can take action to address it. Ultimately, understanding the fundamentals of critical race theory is essential in order to make meaningful progress towards a more equitable and just society. Critical race theory, CRT, is a framework that examines how racism manifests itself through society's systems, such as education or law enforcement, and how these systems perpetuate racial inequality throughout generations. CRT looks at how power dynamics between races affect access to resources like education or job opportunities, which can ultimately lead to disparities in health outcomes based on race alone. Thinking in fundamentals requires us all to look beyond individual acts of racism or bigotry. It requires us all to recognize that institutionalized racism exists across multiple systems within society which have been designed over hundreds of years, specifically designed with inequity in mind. The work done by Gabor Mate, Dr. Phil, and critical race theorists helps us understand why it's important for us to think deeply about our world today and how different forms of oppression manifest themselves even today through unequal access to resources based upon race alone. It's essential for us to recognize how systemic racism has seeped into every aspect of our lives if we want real change going forward, because only then can we truly begin healing from centuries-old wounds that still fester today without much acknowledgement or reparation from those who caused them in the first place, until now. There's a danger to not thinking about fundamentals. Once we lose sight of the basics, it's difficult to get back on track. For example, if we can't afford quality food, we are likely to succumb to unhealthy eating habits. If we can't get a good night's sleep, our health suffers. If we don't have access to quality education, we can't effectively compete in the workforce. If we don't start to understand how institutionalized racism has influenced our world and the systems that perpetuate it, then we're going to be doomed to repeat the same mistakes over and over again. The most nefarious form of racism has been committed against our black and brown siblings for hundreds of years. The reality of this is that as a nation we have failed to recognize this fact for so long. The American story has been one of colonialism and slavery, which resulted in the exploitation of our black and brown brothers and sisters, their children, and their children's children. In many ways, this is what has allowed our nation to prosper for so long. The wealth of our nation has been based on the exploitation of the black and brown community for so long that many white Americans have failed to recognize the harm that has been done. In the modern world, racism has not disappeared. It has morphed into new, insidious forms that are perpetuated by institutions and individuals alike. Systemic racism has crept into almost every aspect of our society, infiltrating our education systems, criminal justice systems, and economic systems. It is essential that we all think critically about our world in order to identify and address these systemic issues if we want to see real progress made in the fight against racism. Racism is not reserved only for African Americans, but is practiced in other countries against individuals of color as well. It is important to recognize that this is not just a U.S. issue, but one that is global in scope as well. In addition, different races such as Latinos and Asians experience racism in unique ways due to their ancestral backgrounds. For example, Latinos are often the target of racism due to their Spanish heritage. Similarly, Asians are often subjected to racism because they are seen as intelligent and successful, even when they are not. This happens because Asians are frequently portrayed as being in charge of all things financial, which fuels the stereotype that they are manipulative and untrustworthy. This can make it difficult for Asians to find jobs or gain access to education, even when they are qualified. In addition, racism against Asians happens in subtle ways, such as being ignored or spoken down to. This is often due to the stereotype that Asians are only good at math and science, which is not accurate. For example, there are many successful Asian Americans who are also entertainers, such as Jamie Chung and Mindy Kaling. However, there are also many cases of Asians being negatively stereotyped in the media. For example, Johnny Depp's character in the 2011 film The Lone Ranger was a stereotype of an Asian pirate. This is a result of the model minority myth, which perpetuates the idea that Asians are successful because they do not experience the same level of racism that other minority groups do. This myth obscures the valid experiences of Asian Americans and denies them their rightful place in the communities in which they live. It also denies the existence of racism against Asians and other minority groups. Jews and Arabs also experienced systematic discrimination, which led to a duality in their experiences. On the one hand, they were subjected to the same types of systemic hatred and violence that other groups were subjected to. They were also targets of economic boycotts and were prevented from owning land or opening businesses. This persecution led to a sense of isolation and despair for Jewish and Arab communities. Jews, like Arabs, are frequently targeted for discrimination and hate crimes. One example that comes to mind was an event that happened in 2014. A Jewish woman in Houston was attacked with a crowbar and a BB gun. The assailant yelled, "I'm going to kill all you Jews," before assaulting the victim. This type of violence is not unique to Jews, as Muslims and Christians have also been the victims of hate crimes. For example, there was a shooting at a mosque in Quebec in which 5 people were killed. In addition, there have been multiple hate crimes against Muslims in the U.S., including a 2015 attack in Kansas in which an assailant shouted Allahu Akbar during the attack. This type of violence is not limited to any one group, and it is important to remember that all members of the community are vulnerable to these types of attacks. The Japanese Christians forced to trample on Christ's image and the Coptic Christians in Egypt that have been targeted for centuries demonstrate the lengths to which people will go to persecute those of differing faiths. In more recent times, the rise of white supremacy has led to an increase in hate-based attacks against Jews, Muslims, and people of color. Furthermore, it is essential to recognize that racism exists in all communities. Finally, there is the idea of the pain left over from the experience of one's ancestors. This pain is often used to justify the hatred that exists between Arabs and Jews. For example, the Yasser Arafat song Kafaya is often used to justify the hatred that Arabs feel towards Jews. This song encourages Palestinians to fight and kill Jews, and it is sung at Arafat's funeral. This song serves as a reminder of the pain that Palestinians have experienced over the years. This pain is often passed down from generation to generation, and it can be difficult for people to overcome. For example, the memory of the Holocaust can be so painful that it prevents people from living normal lives. This is why it is important to remember the Holocaust, as it is a reminder of the genocide that was carried out against the Jewish people. Colonialism and the violence perpetuated between different races on one another is a common occurrence in history. For example, during the height of the British Empire, there was a great deal of violence perpetuated between the British and the Indians. British colonialism was based on the idea that the British were superior to the Indians and that they deserved to rule over them. This type of violence led to the destruction of schools, churches, and other social institutions. It is impossible to erase history, but it is important to remember the past and to learn from it. By learning from the mistakes of the past, we can ensure that similar atrocities do not happen in the future. It is also essential that we create an atmosphere of understanding and acceptance between different cultures and religions.